Steven Seagal's first day in prison didn't feel real. The heavy metal gates closed behind him with a sound that echoed deep in his chest. Clang, that sound wasn't from a movie set. There were no cameras. No second takes. This was real. The air inside the prison was thick, mixed with sweat, steel, and silence that felt louder than noise. Inmates stood along the railings, watching him. Some whispered, some smiled, some just stared, like predators deciding whether something was worth testing. Steven walked slowly, calmly. No fear on his face. No anger either, just focus. The guards led him down a narrow corridor toward the cell block. Every step echoed. Boots, chains, breathing. He could feel eyes on his back the entire time. Then it happened. A massive shadow moved ahead of him. A man stepped into the hallway and stopped, blocking the path completely. He was huge. At least 300 pounds. Muscles like stone arms covered in old scars. The kind of man who didn't need to say much, because his size already spoke for him. The guard stopped walking. That's when Steven knew. This wasn't an accident. The inmate turned slowly and looked down at him with a crooked smile. "Well, look what we got here," the man said. "A movie star." Some inmates laughed quietly. Others leaned forward, interested now. Steven stopped a few feet away. He didn't raise his voice, didn't clench his fists. He simply looked at the man and said calmly, "I'm just trying to get to my cell." The big inmate stepped closer, invading his space. "This isn't Hollywood," he said. "People don't just walk past me." The hallway went quiet. You could hear breathing. You could hear tension. Steven felt it too, but his face didn't change. Years of discipline, years of control. He met the man's eyes and said, slowly and clearly, "You're blocking my path." The inmate laughed. "And what are you going to do about it?" The guards didn't move. The inmates waited. No one knew it yet. But this moment, right here, was about to become something people would talk about for years, because the next few seconds would decide one thing. Was Steven Seagal just another famous name, or a man no one in that prison would ever forget? Before we continue, Faye, where are you watching from? And respect to those who stay calm under pressure. Faye, the hallway felt smaller now. The big inmate stood inches away from Steven Seagal, his chest rising and falling slowly, like he was enjoying the moment. This wasn't about anger. This was about control, about sending a message. Around them, other inmates had stopped pretending not to watch. Conversations faded. Footsteps slowed. Even the guards leaned back slightly, letting things play out the way prison rules often did. Steven could feel the tension in the air. But he stayed calm, very calm. The inmate tilted his head and looked Steven up and down. "Funny," he said. "You don't look scared." Steven replied quietly, "I've learned that fear only helps the wrong person." That answer caught a few people off guard. The big man laughed, but it was forced. "You talk like you know something," he said. "In here, size is knowledge." He pushed Steven's shoulder with one thick finger. Not hard, but enough to test him. Steven took half a step back to keep balance. Still no reaction. No anger, no shouting. Just control. "That's your warning." The inmate said, "Turn around." Steven looked past him, down the hallway toward the cells. "I won't," he said. That single sentence changed everything. The big man's smile vanished. His jaw tightened. He shoved Steven harder this time. Enough that a few inmates gasped. Steven steadied himself. Then, for the first time, his voice changed. Not louder, just firmer. "You don't need to do this," he said. "But if you continue, you won't like the result." The inmate exploded in laughter. "You threatening me?" "No," Steven replied. "I'm explaining." That word, explaining, hung in the air. The inmate swung his arm, slow but heavy, aiming to shove Steven against the wall. He expected panic. He expected resistance. What he didn't expect was speed. Steven moved before anyone realized what was happening. He stepped inside the man's reach, turned slightly, and caught the wrist. Not with force, but precision. Years of training showed in a single motion. He twisted the arm just enough to take balance away. The big inmate grunted in surprise. Steven stayed close, low, controlled. He shifted his weight and used the man's own momentum against him. No wild movements. No wasted energy, just efficiency. The hallway erupted in noise, shouts, gasps. Simone yelled, "Yo!" The big man stumbled forward, confused, suddenly unsure. He tried to pull away. But Steven's grip tightened, not crushing, just exact. Steven leaned in close and spoke calmly, so only the inmate could hear him. "This ends now." In that moment, the inmate understood something important. This wasn't a movie fight. This wasn't a bluff. And Steven Seagal wasn't the man he thought he was. The big inmate froze, not because he was hurt, but because something in Steven Seagal's voice told him this situation was no longer under his control. Steven leaned in slightly, close enough that no one else could hear him over the noise in the hallway. "You're strong," Steven said quietly, "but strength without control destroys itself." The inmate tried to laugh it off, but the sound never came. Steven's grip wasn't painful, but it was exact. Every small movement the inmate made only made things worse for him. He realized quickly that pulling harder didn't help. Neither did anger. Steven continued, calm as ever. "I don't want to embarrass you. I don't want to hurt you. But if you force me to finish this, I will." That's when the inmate understood something important. This man wasn't guessing. He wasn't bluffing. And he wasn't afraid. The inmate shifted his weight, trying one last time to overpower Steven with size alone. It was a mistake. Steven stepped slightly to the side and lowered his center of gravity. In one smooth motion, he redirected the inmate's balance forward. The movement was almost invisible. No wild throw, no dramatic slam, but the result was undeniable. The 300-pound man hit the floor hard. The sound echoed down the corridor. The entire block went silent. Steven stayed standing, breathing steady, posture relaxed. He kept one hand on the inmate's arm, applying just enough pressure to keep him still. The inmate groaned, more shocked than injured. "I said this ends now," Steven repeated calmly. The guards rushed forward at last, shouting orders. One raised his baton, ready to intervene, but stopped when he saw the situation clearly. Steven wasn't attacking, he was controlling. "Let him up," a guard barked. Steven slowly released the hold and stepped back, hands open, showing no threat. He didn't look angry. He didn't look proud. He looked finished. The inmate stayed on the ground for a few seconds, then slowly pushed himself up. He didn't look at Steven right away. When he finally did, his expression had changed. No smile, no challenge. Just respect mixed with disbelief. The guard separated them and ordered Steven to move along. As Steven walked away toward his cell, something strange happened. No one said a word. Inmates stepped aside without conversations didn't restart. Eyes followed him, not with hostility, but caution. Words spread fast in prison. Not that Steven Seagal won a fight, but that he ended one without losing control. Later that evening, during dinner, the big inmate, now sitting quietly at a table, was asked what happened. Simone whispered, "What did he say to you?" The man shook his head. "He didn't threaten me," he said. "That's the scary part," another inmate asked. "You gonna try him again?" The big man looked across the room at Steven, who sat alone, calm, eating slowly. "No," he said firmly. "I already learned." From that day on, Steven was never tested again, not because he demanded fear, not because he showed off, but because everyone understood one simple truth. He didn't need to prove anything. In a place where violence spoke loudest, Steven Seagal had spoken softly, and that made people listen. And long after that first day, inmates would still talk about it, not as a rumor, not as a boast, but as a lesson. Some men carry power in their size. Others carry it in their discipline, and the most dangerous ones are the ones who stay calm when everyone else loses control. In one smooth motion, faster than anyone could imagine, Steven Seagal moved inside the massive inmate's reach. Every step was controlled, precise. There was no wild energy, no wasted motion, just efficiency. Years of training and discipline showed in every small adjustment. He twisted the inmate's wrist ever so slightly, shifted his weight at the exact right angle, and suddenly, boom, the 300-pound man hit the floor hard. The sound reverberated down the hallway, bouncing off steel doors and concrete walls. Gasps erupted everywhere. Other inmates froze mid-step. Conversations stopped. Even the guards paused, uncertain if they should intervene. Some pulled out their phones instinctively. Everyone knew this was a moment that would be remembered. The massive inmate, Tank as everyone called him, tried to move, tried to push himself up, but he couldn't. Every instinct he had failed him. His size, which moments ago made him untouchable in his mind, was useless. Precision had beaten brute force. He leaned down, close enough that only Tank could hear him, and whispered a few words, calm, deliberate, and heavy with meaning. "You end this now. Stop pretending you're bigger than the rules." The inmate's chest heaved. His eyes widened. For the first time, he realized he was in a situation where raw strength alone didn't matter. Every shove, every step, every ounce of muscle he had used to intimidate others. It was irrelevant against someone who moved with control. The hallway was silent, not a sound except for Tank's labored breathing and Steven's steady, measured exhalation. And then, the inmate stopped struggling. Just like that, the struggle was over. Others in the corridor looked on, mouths open. Some whispered to each other, "Did he just?" And, "No way." Steven stood, upright slowly, releasing his hold completely. His expression didn't change, calm, focused, collected. There was no anger, no celebration, just presence. Tank stayed on the floor for a long moment, stunned. The realization slowly sank in. He had been tested, and he had lost. Not because he was weak, but because he had underestimated his opponent. The guards finally stepped forward, cautious but aware that intervention was no longer needed. Steven didn't move. He simply nodded politely and continued toward his cell. The inmates parted instinctively, giving him a clear path. No one blocked him again. From that day, the legend of the first encounter spread quietly but quickly. It wasn't a fight to boast about. No one needed to talk loudly about who was strongest. Everyone understood what happened. Even without words, power is not measured by size or volume. Later that night, Tank sat alone, nursing his pride more than anything else. Someone approached him and asked what Steven had whispered. Tank shook his head slowly. "It doesn't matter what he said," he admitted. "It was enough just to know he could have done whatever he wanted and didn't. That's scary." Other inmates realized that this was more than an encounter. It was a lesson. The man who stays calm under pressure, the one who acts only when necessary, is often the one who controls the world around him. Steven Seagal didn't just survive his first day in prison. He redefined what it meant to be respected. Not through fear, not through shouting or fighting, but through skill, discipline, and presence. By the time the night fell, the cell block had changed. Not in rules, not in the official order of things, but in attitude. Everyone had learned something critical that day. True strength speaks softly. True respect is earned silently. And those who thought they were unstoppable realized maybe they weren't. A guard finally shouted, "Break it up." But by then, it was already over. Tank, the massive 300-pound inmate who had spent the last few minutes testing every inch of Steven Seagal's patience and skill, tapped the floor. A single, deliberate tap submission. Acceptance. The sound echoed through the hallway louder than any shout. The tension that had gripped the block for minutes dissolved instantly, replaced by a stunned, almost reverent silence. Other inmates stared, some unable to believe what had just happened. Some whispered to each other, unsure if what they had witnessed was real. "Do you know who that is?" one inmate whispered, his voice trembling slightly. Another shook his head slowly, eyes wide. That's Steven Seagal, the real one." Murmurs spread like wildfire. A quiet storm of recognition swept through the block. Phones were out, eyes glued to the man who had just walked through an impossible confrontation and ended it with control, not chaos. Steven walked slowly toward his cell, each step deliberate, calm, unshakable. The hallway felt different now. Inmates who had been leaning forward, ready to challenge anyone, now parted instinctively, not out of fear, not because they had been told to, but because they knew. They understood that this was no ordinary man, and that he didn't need to prove himself with aggression. Tank pushed himself off the floor, muscles tense. But he did not challenge Steven again. He stood, rubbing his wrist, shaking his head, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Pride had been stripped from him, not through humiliation, but through something far more powerful, acknowledged mastery ladder. A group of inmates gathered near the tables, whispering. He didn't even have to hit him, one said. Just moved, and it was over. And Tank, he knew it, he just submitted. Nobody's gonna touch him again. By the time Steven reached his cell, the entire block had changed, not in rules or official authority, but in the unspoken code that governs these walls. Respect had been redefined. No one blocked his path again. Doors opened automatically, conversations paused when he walked by, and even the toughest inmates who prided themselves on intimidation began to think twice before acting. For Steven, it was simple. He didn't crave recognition. He didn't need to assert dominance. He simply moved through the day, calm, composed, unshaken. But everyone around him learned an important lesson. True power doesn't announce itself, Tank. The massive man who had thought his size was invincible finally approached Steven hours later, outside the mess hall. He didn't speak at first, just nodded. A gesture that said more than words ever could. Steven nodded back, acknowledging the silent truce. That day, the legend of Steven Seagal's first prison encounter began, not as a story of violence, not as a tale of brute force, but as a story of precision, discipline, and respect earned, not demanded. Even the guards, who had witnessed countless fights, shook their heads in disbelief. "I've seen a lot in this block," one muttered to another. "But I've never seen anyone handle a challenge like that. Not like that." From that moment on, Steven walked the prison without a single challenge. He didn't need to prove himself again. He didn't need to raise a hand. The reputation had been made, and it spread quietly, like a current under the surface, moving through the block, reminding everyone that strength is more than muscle, respect is more than fear, and in a place designed to test limits every single day, that truth became something that no one could ignore. Later that day, Tank, the massive 300-pound inmate who had challenged Steven Seagal, was seen sitting quietly in the corner of the mess hall. He wasn't injured. Not really. His muscles weren't bruised. His body wasn't broken. But his pride, that was another story. He nursed it like it had been wounded in a battle no one else could see. Every movement was measured, as if even the act of turning his head required thought. Tank wasn't used to losing, and today, he had. Not in a fight. He had been defeated by control, precision, and calm. Some of the other inmates gathered nearby, whispering among themselves, eyes flicking occasionally toward the man who had humbled the unstoppable Tank. Curiosity, awe, and even a hint of fear hung in the air. Finally, one brave soul leaned in and asked quietly, "What did he say to you? I mean, what did Steven say?" Tank shook his head slowly. His large hands clenched into fists and then relaxed. He looked down at the table for a moment, then answered simply, almost in awe, I don't want that man angry at me." The words were short, but they carried weight, not just for Tank, but for everyone listening. In that single sentence was the recognition of true power, the kind that doesn't roar, doesn't need to be loud, and doesn't need witnesses. It doesn't demand fear. It earns it silently, naturally, without explanation. Steven Seagal never bragged about what had happened. He didn't retell the story to the guards. He didn't boast in the cafeteria. He didn't even tell the other inmates directly. He simply moved through his day, calm, composed, unshaken. And that was the point. He didn't need to prove himself again. He didn't need to raise a hand, flex a muscle, or show off a trick. The moment had already happened. The lesson had already been learned. Respect had been earned, silently, undeniably. For Tank, the lesson was clear. Size and strength could only take you so far. Brute force could intimidate, but it could not command. Real control, discipline, focus, and measured action. Those were the tools that mattered. And when faced with someone who had mastered them, even the biggest, strongest, most confident person could be humbled. The rest of the prison watched, whether they admitted it or not. Conversations slowed, walkways cleared, challenges faded before they even began. Steven Seagal didn't have to say, "I'm not to be messed with." Everyone already understood. Even the guards, who had seen countless fights and countless displays of dominance, shook their heads quietly. One of them muttered under his breath, "I've seen tough men, I've seen fights. But I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that. Not like him." That evening, as the lights dimmed and the block settled into the usual rhythm of muted voices and clanging doors, the story of the first encounter quietly became legend. Not a legend of brute strength, not a legend of fear, but a legend of calm precision and silent authority. Tank didn't challenge anyone again. Not because he was afraid of injury, not because of anger, but because he understood something deeper now. Some people carry power in such a way that it doesn't need to be proven, and it doesn't need witnesses. And when you meet someone like that, it's better to respect them than test them. Steven Seagal had arrived in prison as a new face, unknown to most. By the end of the day, he had walked through the block, earned respect silently, and reminded everyone of a lesson, often forgotten in places ruled by noise and aggression. True strength is calm, true control is quiet, true respect is earned, not demanded. And with that, Steven walked on, unchallenged, unshaken, and completely in command of himself. And of the unspoken order around him. True strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't shout. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't feel the need to prove anything. Some people mistake loud voices and angry gestures for power. They think dominance comes from size, volume, or intimidation. They measure it in fear, in chaos, in the reaction of others, but real power is different. Real power waits, it observes, it calculates, it chooses its moment carefully. It acts only when necessary. Steven Seagal's first day in prison was a lesson in this. Everyone expected a fight. Everyone expected a loud, dramatic display, but that's not what happened. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't throw the first punch. He didn't make a scene. He moved with precision. He stayed calm. He controlled himself. And in doing so, he controlled the entire room. Tank, the 300-pound inmate who had tried to intimidate him, learned something that day. Strength isn't about muscle. Power isn't about fear. Respect isn't demanded. It's earned. By the time Steven walked down the hallway toward his cell, no one blocked his path again. Not because they feared him physically, not because they had been forced, but because they had seen him in action and understood something deeper. This was a man whose calmness was a weapon, whose discipline was a shield, whose silent authority could command more than any loud threat ever could. Even the guards, people who had witnessed fights and challenges countless times, knew it. They shook their heads in disbelief. Some muttered quietly to each other, "I've seen tough men in here. But I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that." The lesson spread quickly throughout the prison, not through gossip or exaggeration, but through observation. People changed the way they walked down the halls. People thought twice before testing limits. People realized that real strength doesn't scream. It proves itself quietly. Tank, who had spent years believing size and intimidation were everything, walked away with a new understanding. Pride had been humbled, but it wasn't crushed. He respected Steven Seagal, not out of fear, but because he recognized mastery when he saw it. And that's the lesson for all of us. In life, we encounter people in positions of challenge or conflict. We see them as small, weak, or unimportant. We sometimes judge them based on appearance, background, or circumstances. But strength doesn't always announce itself. Power doesn't always wear a label. And respect isn't a trophy you give to the loudest voice in the room. Never judge someone by where they stand, especially if you don't know what they've survived. The quiet ones, the disciplined ones, the ones who act only when necessary, they are often the ones who move the world around them. So the next time you face a challenge, the next time someone tests you, or the next time you feel judged unfairly, remember Steven Seagal's first day in prison. It wasn't about violence. It wasn't about winning a fight. It was about calm, control, and the silent authority of real strength. Strength is measured in patience. Power is measured in restraint. Respect is measured in the choices you make when no one is watching. If you believe in this kind of strength, type respect in the comments. Let it remind the world, and yourself, that real power is quiet, deliberate, and undeniable. And before you go, hey, where are you watching from? I see you, every single one of you, because the world needs more people who understand. True power doesn't need to scream. True authority doesn't need to threaten. True respect is earned silently, every day, through action, discipline, and integrity. So stay calm under pressure. Move with purpose. Act only when necessary. And never forget. The people you underestimate today could be the ones you end up looking up to tomorrow.